So, as you'll remember from yesterday, the battle's ended. They've taken the plaza. The Mexicans have. It should. Alright, hold on one second. So, as you'll remember from yesterday, the Mexicans have stormed the plaza like ants running over the walls. They killed Colonel Bowie. They killed Crockett. They killed Colonel Travis. And so now, and I've tried twice to share the camera. There we go. All right, and so now Colonel Almonte from the Mexican army has come to the chapel where Billy and Lupe are protecting all the women and children. And he has informed Billy that the battle is over, there's no prisoners, and that realization has started to set in with Billy, but he hasn't really understood what it all means yet, but he will. Chapter 12. Go tell them the battle is over, I said to Lupe. She went toward the barricade. Miss Dickinson handed Angelina to Lupe and helped Miss Mendoza and the other women over the barricade. Miss Dickinson's face was gray in the morning light. Her dress was soiled. It was only 9 o'clock, but it seemed as if it had been years since the Mexicans began to come over the walls. Miss Dickinson took Angelina in her arms and came and stood beside me. Colonel Almonte, senora, the officer said, making his military bow to her. General Santa Anna tenders his compliments and offers you safe conduct. I am ready, Miss Dickinson said, and turned her stony face toward the town. Lupe ran to her mother, and I fell in beside Miss Dickinson. Where is Buck? I whispered as soon as Colonel Almonte was out of earshot. He's gone, Miss Dickinson said, without turning her eyes from the white caliche road in front of her. So here we go. We see the plaza of the Alamo. We see Miss Dickinson, Miss Mendoza, and all the women and children coming out of the chapel. And you see the dead bodies of all the Texians on the ground. And you see the Mexican soldiers there as well. As we went through the chapel door, a party of officials entered the main gate. General Santa Anna was surrounded by his staff of officers, and with him was Francisco Ruiz, the alcalde of San Antonio de Bexar. They had come to inspect the scene of their victory. Colonel Almonte stood at attention. El Presidente! The Mexicans cheered. I spit upon him! Lupe shouted before Miss Mendoza could stop her. Lupe never surrendered. She had to be dragged. We trudged onward toward the town. From the tower of San Fernando Cathedral floated the blood-red flag that General Santa Anna had placed there. I looked back at the crumbled walls of the Alamo. The scaffolding had caught fire, and the smoke rose from it. The animal pen was gone. The animal pen was empty. All the horses and Pedro were gone. It was a scene I could not bear to look at or describe, so I shut my eyes and my mind to it and stumbled towards Bexar. At the garrison they gave us food. I had not known how hungry I was. I fell upon it like a starved animal, but Miss Dickinson would not eat. We waited until afternoon in the empty guard room, with a sentry at the door walking up and down with a drawn bayonet. At 3 o'clock, a rustle seemed to pass through our prison, and Colonel Almonte came again. He said that Santa Anna desired an audience with Miss Dickinson, who was to follow him. So, Miss Dickinson is the oldest, kind of the of the women and children survivors. And you can see that a lot of the people around her, the women and the other women and the children, all trust Miss Dickinson. And Santa Anna and Colonel Almonte could really read it and understand that. And so that's why she was chosen for this audience with with Santa Anna. "The boy goes with me," Miss Dickinson said. "I have promised on my honor." "The general did not send for him," Colonel Almonte interrupted. "Will, please carry the baby," she said, and put Angelina in my arms. She gave me a stern look. I felt like a fool carrying the infant, but I did as she bade me. With Colonel Almonte leading the way, we went to Santa Anna's quarters. We were taken to a huge apartment in the garrison. The main room was well furnished with a great mahogany desk and a silky rug on the floor. On the walls were the crossed flags of Mexico, with its hissing snake and the president's own flag. Santa Anna was sitting behind the desk. I do not know what I expected to see. A devil with horns, breathing smoke and fire. I guess an ogre? I had never thought in my mind what the enemy would be. He was only a man. Tall, thin man. 5'10", I would say, with a long, thin face, dark and sallow of complexion, a roach of black hair, unruly hair, and fiery black eyes. So we've got a picture of Santa Anna, Miss Dickinson, Colonel Almonte, Billy, and Angelina. His mouth was cruel, but at the same time his face looked sad, or as if he had suffered from a sickness. He was very nervous. He was wearing a splendid uniform of some dark blue stuff with gold epaulets and a scarlet sash. On his black boots were great silver spurs with cruel big rowels. Miss Dickinson stood before him without speaking, her head bent, and I brought up the rear holding Angelina like a nursemaid. I, who had loaded pistols for Davy Crockett. "Senora Dickinson," Colonel Almonte announced. "Senora," said the general, and made her a stiff bow. His eyes went over her as he stood there with her face turned coldly away from him. Even after what she had been through, she was a pretty young woman. Her light gold hair curled up naturally, and her eyes were violet blue, though they now were dimmed with crying. Her dress was wrinkled and soiled, and there was a great spreading blood stain on the skirt. She said nothing. General Santa Anna came toward me and leaned down and took Angelina out of my arms. I looked fearfully at Miss Dickinson, but she motioned me to do nothing. The baby reached out and tugged at one of Santa Anna's gold epaulets. He smiled. "And who is this?" he asked. "My fatherless child," Miss Dickinson snapped, throwing her head back like a balky Mustang. "Your husband was a soldier?" Santa Anna asked. "He died fighting for liberty on the walls of the Alamo," Miss Dickinson said haughtily. So, Santa Anna's asking about Angelina. And Miss Dickinson's response, is that is phrased. She forms it in a way that tells Santa Anna, "Hey, you're the reason why this kid doesn't have a dad." General Santa Anna returned Angelina to her and stood before me. I drew my dirk and stood my ground. "And this rooster? He is alone in the world," Miss Dickinson said, "thanks to your murderers. His brother, a beardless boy, bled to death with his head in my lap. I promised him to care for this child." "You may sheath your weapon," General Santa Anna said to me. "I will not harm you." But the knife fell from my hand, for I realized for the first time that Buck had really gone where I would not find him again on this earth. So Billy's just realized that Buck's dead. Like dead. And that he died after he climbed over the barricade, and he died in Miss Dickinson's lap. The tears pushed themselves from behind my lids and ran down my face. I see you are not partial to our hospitality, General Santa Anna said to Miss Dickinson. In that case, I will give you safe conduct to the headquarters of General Houston. I presume that you will tell him what you have just told me. I will tell everything about the last 12 days, Miss Dickinson said coldly. You may add, General Santa Anna said, that the same fate awaits every other man who bears arms against Mexico and Texas. His face had turned dark and angry. Provide them with horses and escort, he ordered Colonel Almonte, and get them out of my sight. He stumped over to the window and stood with his back to us. Colonel Almonte shooed us out of the room and back into our prison. Miss Mendoza and Lupe were huddled there on a wooden bench. Miss Mendoza and Miss Dickinson embraced, and Lupe ran to me. He is sending us to General Houston, I said. Lupe began to cry. I want to go with Billy, she moaned. I have heard them talking, Miss Mendoza said. We may be sent to Coahuila to work in the mines as the fate of traitors. Oh no, Miss Dickinson cried. I will speak to General Houston about you. I had not thought about being parted from Lupe. Buck was gone, and she was my only friend. When the soldiers came to take us away, I begged them to let us take the Mendozas, but they only laughed and pushed me back before them. I broke away and ran back to where Lupe was huddled on the bench crying. I touched her shoulder. Don't cry, Lupe, I said. I will find you when it is over. I want to go with you, Lupe wailed. I want to go with you. I dragged off my old coonskin hat that Davy Crockett had given me. Here, I said, keep this, and do not forget the hat dance. You promised to teach it to me. I hated to give it up, but it was the best thing I had to give to her. Lupe took the hat by its tail, but she did not stop crying. The Mexican soldier came over then and dragged me away with him. Adios, I said. Don't forget me. Go with God, Miss Mendoza said and gave me a blessing. Vaya con Dios. Lupe put the hat on backwards with the coon tail hanging in her face. She picked up a rock on the floor of the guardroom and hurled it at the soldier, but it just glanced off his back, and he just laughed at her. The last I saw of her, she was stamping her foot and calling my name. Chapter 13. One of the differences between what happens to Miss Mendoza and what happens to Miss Dickinson is you'll see that Miss Dickinson's family was Anglo-American, so they probably had relatives, or they themselves moved from the United States into Texas. Miss Mendoza's family were from Mexico, and so that's one of the differences. You heard them say that they were treated like traitors, and that's because they were believed to, they were Mexican, and they weren't Mexicans, and they were Mexicans fighting for a revolution, fighting for their independence, and so that's why it was viewed as treason. Chapter 13. Off to Gonzales. We rode out at sunset, Miss Dickinson and me and Joe, Colonel Travis's body servant. We were in the custody of a man named Ben, I never knew his last name, who was the personal servant of General Santa Anna. On the edge of town, we were met by Captain Erastus Smith, General Houston's scout, who joined the party to lead us. General Houston had sent him to bring us to his camp. Captain Smith was a quiet man, with a listening look on his face. He was a famous frontiersman and Indian scout, and he was always called Deaf Smith. He wasn't really deaf. He pretended to be more hard of hearing than he was as part of his spying. He never said much, though, and he moved as quietly as a shadow. Those kind of sound like good traits if you're a scout or a spy. Jeff Smith said General Houston had set off for Gonzales to recruit the Texas Army, and we rode there instead of towards Washington on the Brazos. It was at least 75 miles. So we've got Jeff Smith there, and Billy. It was at least 75 miles, and it took us near on to 3 days. We were worn down to a nub. Although 2 Mexicans had brought the news of the fall of the Alamo before we got there, General Houston believed it was a trick. He said that the report was a lie, but his army was nervous. When Miss Dickinson and I were brought before General Houston and told him the terrible story of the fall of the Alamo, panic ran through the town like a wildfire. The 30 men who had ridden from Gonzales to the defense of the Alamo had left wives and families behind, who now heard they were dead. General Houston walked among the troops, trying to quiet them down. For there was a report that the advance guard of General Santa Anna's army was already in sight. General Houston ordered all supplies to be burned. He sank his cannon in the river. He put the women and children of Gonzales in the army baggage wagons. Miss Dickinson and Angelina were given a place there, and I told them goodbye. Before we could get a night's sleep, we were in retreat. That means running away. I fell in with a company and began to march. Nobody questioned that I was a soldier now. I was in Deaf Smith's rear guard, and we were followed by the refugees from Gonzales. Families with children and dogs and household goods and wagons. It was a hot night and dark as a pitch. We marched through a post oak wood and sand that was ankle deep. Mosquitoes swarmed over us and we were all bitten. When morning came, we stopped for breakfast. The women cooked. That was one help about traveling with a whole bunch of women and children, but it slowed things down. General Houston took care of everybody. He heard that an old blind lady had been left behind, and he sent a wagon back after her. Finally, after days of struggling, we got to the Lavaca River and bivouacked to wait for Colonel Fannon's army. General Houston had ordered him to join us, but Colonel Fannin, who wouldn't give in for the Alamo, wouldn't give in for General Houston. Colonel Fannin never came. While we waited, Jeff Smith captured a Mexican scout from General Sesma's army, which was drawn up not too far from us. We expected to do battle any minute. We waited for 5 days, always expecting to hear from Colonel Fannin. But on March 25th, a Gonzales refugee named Peter Kerr dashed into camp on a lathered horse, shouting that Fannin had surrendered and Goliad had fallen. General Houston swore it was a lie, but the next day at sunset, we began to retreat in earnest. That night we covered 30 miles. 30 miles on foot. The next day we pressed on. It began to rain as we slithered up the clay banks of the Brazos River. For 3 days, it was awful. It never stopped raining, and we never stopped slogging through the mud of the Brazos bottoms. In 3 days, we made only 18 miles. At the end of that time, we knew for sure that Fannin had surrendered, and that after his surrender, he and 390 men had been shot in cold blood. So remember, okay, Santa Anna was very, very clear about his, I'm not taking any prisoners. And so at Goliad, after the Alamo, Fannin was trying to keep Goliad under Texas control. And the Mexican army surrounded them, and Fannin surrendered, and General Santa Anna didn't care. General Santa Anna gave the order that all the prisoners were to be shot and executed. Let's see. It had done no... General Santa Anna seemed to mean what he said. It had done Fannin no good to try to save his army. General Houston walked among us. He was a Tall, commanding figure, straight as an Indian, with a big head and face and deep-set eyes. You felt the strength about him, and he was a giver of commands and asked nobody's advice. "If I err, the blame is mine," he said. While he was strong and bold, he was humble too, and he could do anything. We didn't have a bugle in that army. All we had was a drum. But General Houston beat out reveille and the tattoo on that old drum himself. He had no uniform, but he wore a Cherokee coat and a buckskin vest and a broad hat with a feather in it. He wore high-heeled boots with silver spurs that had 3-inch rowels, and his pistol was stuck in his belt. On that march, he didn't even have a tent for himself, and he studied his maps sitting out in the rain. He carried a copy of Gulliver's Travels to read. He whittled sticks and wrote poetry. He was a strange soldier. We pressed on towards the Sabine River, where the United States Army was encamped. Some people thought General Houston meant to retreat right over the Sabine and give up. We bivouacked in the Brazos Bottoms, not far from San Felipe, and General Houston began to organize our straggling men back into a real army. He drilled us day and night. Santa Anna was advancing on San Felipe, and for 4 days he tried to cross the river with his artillery, but we stayed him off. While we were there, we got 2 new cannon, a gift to General Houston from friends in Cincinnati, Ohio. We named them the Twin Sisters. So if you remember, when they left Gonzales, their cannon was, for some reason or another, their cannon wouldn't have traveled well. So General Houston ordered that it was sank to the bottom of the river there. But now they're near San Felipe and they're training their men, and so General Houston gets 2 new cannons from friends in Cincinnati. General Houston began to salvage old iron to use for ammunition. He helped the blacksmith, and once when I went with another fellow in my company to get his rifle fixed, General Houston fixed the hammer lock on the gun for him. "What are you doing here, boy?" he said to me. "Refugees are supposed to stay in their own camp." "I am in the army," I asked. "How old are you?" he asked me. 16, I lied. "Know anything about blacksmithing?" "I worked in a smithy." "Stay here and help this man," he said. "I don't believe you are 16. "All right," I said, but I had my own plans. When the battle came, I meant to be in it. I meant to be in it for Buck and Davy Crockett and all the people who had been in the Alamo. We pushed on down the Harrisburg Road, if you could call it that. It was just a bog of mud from one end to the other. The wagons had to be carried on the backs of the men, or they would just bog down out of sight. The 2 cannon were even worse. They were so heavy, but General Houston set great store by them. They had to be carried too. The bad language that went with this operation cannot be repeated. On the 18th of April, we arrived at the near shore of Buffalo Bayou. The town of Harrisburg across the bayou was in flames. We could see the fire leaping up and the black smoke pouring off. Santa Anna had already been there. Deaf Smith swam the bayou in the dead of night and came back with 2 Mexican prisoners. They were scouts, and we learned from them that Santa Anna had burned Harrisburg because he thought the Texas government was there. But the government had fled to Galveston. So the Texas government used to be, for like a little bit during the Revolution, when they left San Felipe, they went to Harrisburg. But they left Harrisburg because Santa Anna was on his way, and they went to Galveston. But Santa Anna had burnt Harrisburg looking for the Texas government. General Houston now...
How many colors don't you like?
Okay, I'll be right there. I'll be right there. General Houston now realized that Santa Anna and his army were about 10 miles away, groping through the marshes around Galveston Bay. It was swamp country, and the Mexicans didn't understand it. Excitement ran through the ranks of our army. We knew that we were about to strike back. In spite of all I had seen, I had literally never been a soldier in battle. It was too late for me to be afraid, and a thrill ran through me. In my heart burned the flame of revenge. I had a gun at last, and I had a heart for any fate. Okay, so he was blacksmithing, but then he ran away, and he's joined the army as they've been marching. And we can see right there, they've got one of those twin sisters, and they're looking at loading it up. And so now they've arrived and right outside of Harrisburg, right by Buffalo Bayou. And tomorrow we'll find out what happens at that battle. Alrighty. So that's it for today. We'll read chapter 14 and 15 and finish the book tomorrow. Thank you very much.